Okay, here's another Gary video. I don't really have much of an outline for this in my head, so video is probably going to have a lot of and me thinking about what I'm going to say next. I want to start off by saying a few words about a comment that I got in my most recent Gary video. This is by First Last. And to be fair, this guy, I guess you would refer to him as like one of my trolls or whatever, because he just leaves a negative comment on every video I make, no matter what the subject matter is. So it's not like I'm bent out of shape about him saying this, but I do want to set the record straight. He says, "Of course Fake Sagan doesn't care about Inmendham at all. He just can't stand the fact that he can't manipulate him. That's why he's not letting go." I'm wondering how many people actually see this interaction that I'm having with Gary in that way. And if they do, I'm forced to wonder why. Because it's like, what reality are you guys living in which Gary has not been a part of my life for over a quarter of the time that I've been alive on planet Earth? Like, I've known this human being for a very long time. Me and him go way back. Is it really so impossible to believe that I just care about the guy and I want him to be happy? Is that so impossible for you guys to believe? Like, I have to have some motivation where, I mean, if you guys think I'm just trying to convert a well-known YouTuber so I can kind of impress the audience and make people go, damn! I mean, why wouldn't I be going after somebody like TJ? If I was able to convert Gary into a Christian, I don't think anyone would consider that like a big surprise or a huge victory. They would just be like, oh, some mentally unbalanced loser becoming a Christian. Well, that happens every day. It wouldn't even be seen as a victory. It would. I don't think anybody would be surprised if Gary did become a Christian. Not that that's ever going to happen. But I'm just kind of disappointed by the way a lot of, because it's not just this First Last guy. A couple of people have made comments along similar lines where they seem to think I just want Gary as some kind of trophy for what a good rhetorician I am or something, and it really has nothing to do with that. Anyway, now I'm going to stop addressing the audience and start addressing you personally, Gary. But I wanted to get that stuff out of the way. So, Gary, I've been, the last video that you recorded to me, I watched it several times. And then after that, I reviewed this whole interaction. I rewatched all of the videos that I made to you, and I rewatched some of the videos that you made to me. And what I've been forced to conclude, and it was really kind of a horrifying realization, is that you're the one with the stronger argument. That is a bitter pill to swallow right there. Now, that doesn't mean I think you're right by any means. There's a very big difference between having the stronger argument and being right. I think the entire history of our system of jurisprudence kind of points to that. In other words, a court decision is hardly ever the correct decision. It's just the decision. But yeah, I mean, Gary, Great Helm was right with what he said about you. Your philosophy is airtight. There's no gap. There's no weakness for me to exploit. The reason that I tried to use an emotional argument to try to change your mind, which is what it is when I, point to your feelings for Ocean and say that that's the inconsistency in your thought. The reason why I tried to use an emotional argument like that is because antinatalism itself is an emotional argument. That's the only way you can respond to it. Like the belief that life sucks and is not worth living is not something that you can refute with facts. It's an emotional argument to begin with. So the only way you can argue against an emotional argument is with another emotional argument. There are no fact claims to either verify or disprove when it comes to this. But the point that I'm at right now is acceptance, and I have learned a lesson from all of this. But I'm done trying to change you, Gary. I think that maybe I was kind of making the same mistake you were making in lacking the capacity to understand how different the world can seem to different people. Your philosophy is predicated on this idea that life is so defined by suffering, that existence is so painful, that not only should we not want life for ourselves, but that it's a great imposition upon as yet uncreated people to bring them into this world. Right? It's almost like levying a tax on someone who doesn't exist yet to create a new life and condemn them to the existence that we live here. But the reason why you see the world that way, Gary, is because life is very painful for you. You find existence to be horrifying and defined by pain and suffering. And you lack the capacity to imagine that anyone else feels differently than you do. Well, I've kind of been making the same mistake when it comes to you. I take a look at your life, and I see a guy who is essentially a shut-in. He's been living in his house for a very long time, doesn't go out much, just kind of spends a lot of time talking to strangers about how horrible life is and how they should all agree with him and commit mass suicide. And it's impossible for me, the fluffy kittenist, to imagine how that could be a fulfilling and happy life. But that's my limitation. That's my that's the failing of my own capacity for imagination. And I think what I've learned from this interaction is that maybe you're not as unhappy as I thought you were. I mean, maybe this is just the life that's right for you. You found what works for you. Because I was going over it and thinking about this, and I realized, if I watch a couple of your videos in a row, it's not like you never smile. It's not like you never laugh. It's not like you never seem to be having a good time telling your jokes and telling your stories. I guess your life isn't that bad. It's just what works for you. However, having accepted that fact and having abandoned any notion that I'm going to change you, and I certainly hope you've abandoned any notion that you're going to change me, because the chance that I'm going to wake up tomorrow as an ethicist is precisely zero. But having abandoned any notion that you and I are going to change one another, I've decided to embark on a new quest. Instead of a quest to change you, I'm on a quest to understand you now. That's what I want to do. So for the rest of this video, I just want to ask you some questions about your philosophy. Essentially, I want to give you what you've wanted all along through this whole interaction, which is to stop talking about personal stuff and get down to talking about your ideas. Well, that's what I want to do now. Okay, so to start off with, there's one thing about antinatalism that I've never understood, and particularly when it comes to your unique brand, ephilism, I understand it even less. And I want to make a little disclaimer first. I am not encouraging you to commit suicide. As a matter of fact, if you ever did commit suicide and there was even a slight inkling in my mind that something that I said was the reason for that, I would never make a YouTube video again, and I would probably never engage in any kind of public speaking again. But I've never understood why antinatalists don't kill themselves if they believe what they claim to believe. Now, if you ask an antinatalist that question, what they'll typically say is something like, well, I accept my limitations as a biological creature that has a self-preservation instinct. You know, I accept that that my genes control my thought, and my genes want to perpetuate themselves, and they don't want me to die, so I don't want to die. I have this instinct to stay alive, and the only thing I can do is ride this out. Like, I can't go back and change the fact that I was born. It's impossible for me to do that. So all I can do is just ride this out, ride out the suffering, and die in my own good time. But that really doesn't make sense to me. Because you're going to die anyway. There's no way that you can avoid that. And the death that you find is probably going to be one caused by disease, frailty, old age, and a death in a hospital bed isn't necessarily the most pleasant one. You know, it could be slow, it could be painful, and it could involve a great deal of suffering. Whereas if you were to just put a gun in your mouth right now and pull the trigger, that's a pretty quick and painless death, and it spares you what, like another 20 or 30 years of the life that you hate, the existence that's defined by nothing but suffering and sorrow. Why would you not take that option? Now, again, please let me reiterate, I am not encouraging you to commit suicide. I just don't understand why you don't. It makes no sense to me. So if you could start off by explaining that, I would find that very useful. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about this idea of negative and positive value to life, and the idea that that procreation, bringing a new life into the world, is sort of like levying a tax against a future generation. It's sort of like you're condemning someone who doesn't exist yet to suffering. And you in Mendham, I'm sorry, why did I just call you in Mendham? You, Gary, have defined this as a form of rape. You've used the term rape. Well, how can you define concretely that life has more negative value than it has positive value? Because it's impossible to measure suffering. There's no metric of pleasure or pain, and those things are so subjective. Like the example I was just talking, like your life, we could take that as an example. To me, from my point of view, I would see your life as being something painful and unpleasant, and yet it seems to work for you. You know, I'm going to talk about sex because. So by the way, like Christians in the audience, like if Jesus Freak and Stephanie are watching this together, turn the video off and just go away. Because I don't need a bunch of stuff in the comments section. Like, oh, you're supposed to be a Christian now. Why are you talking about obscene things in your videos? Guys, there's never been a topic that I've been afraid to talk about, and there never will be. That's not going to change. And the reason why I'm using this as an example is it's simply the only go-to example that I can think of the way that pleasure and pain can be interchangeable and subjective. I'm going to talk about when chicks give me head. Because when I find myself in one of those Donald Trump locker room conversations with other guys where sex comes up, and I'm sure women have the same conversations with other women where, you know, they talk about sex. Well, when I talk about sex with other guys and the topic of blowjobs comes up, They always discover, much to their horror and shock, that I kind of like it when women use their teeth. Well, there's no kind of. I actually do like it. I request it, in fact. And every other guy I've told that to, without exception, has always been like, "Oh, what is wrong with you? Oh, it hurts so bad. Why? Oh, dude." Well, it feels good to me. I like it. So this is precisely what I'm talking about, though, Gary. I mean, something that 99% of the human species considers painful, there's always going to be that 1% that just feels like, well, I like it. I mean, this feels pretty good. So, considering how subjective pleasure and pain really are, how can you claim knowledge that life is objectively more painful than it is pleasurable? How can you claim to know that? Wouldn't you have to be a psychic? Wouldn't you have to have knowledge of other people's experience that the existential isolation of human beings precludes you from having? How are you able to get inside someone else's head and know that life is just nothing but suffering for that person? You can't know that, Gary. Here's another little thought. If the antinatalist refrains from committing suicide because he accepts his own limitations as a biological organism, how come he can't accept the limitations of the world? How come he can't accept the limitations of life? It's like you guys are willing to grudgingly accept that you're not perfect, that there's a flaw in you that keeps you from being able to live your philosophy to the fullest. Yet you can't accept that there are flaws in that the world is less than perfect. The world has to be perfect or it's just not good enough. The example that I used in my comment section of my most recent video about antinatalism is that it's quite literally throwing out the baby with the bathwater. If you've ever heard that term, that should be in the dictionary next to antinatalism. It's almost essentially what the word means: anti-birthism, anti-babyism. That's literally what you guys are doing. Like the term "throwing out the baby with the bathwater" is an idiom that refers to wanting so bad to get rid of what's bad that you also throw out what's good along with it. And it's simply the perfect metaphor for antinatalism. You're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, quite literally. But when it comes to this idea of rape against the rights of people who don't yet exist, I have two questions about that. Here's the first one. What if the unborn child happens to be a person who loves life, who thinks, unlike you, that life has more positive value than it has negative value, that the scales are tipped in favor of pleasure rather than tipped in favor of pain? If that happens to be the case, then aren't you the rapist? Aren't you the rapist taking away that person's right to exist? I suppose you would just justify your decision by saying that the person is deluded. That, if you think that life is good and that there's more positive value than negative value to it, then you're just deluded, so I have to make the decision for you. But isn't that rape, Gary? Isn't that you taking away somebody else's rights? Now, I'm also going to go at this from another direction, and one that perhaps you wouldn't expect. And that's to ask this question: does a person who does not exist have rights? Let me explain what I mean. An antinatalist such as yourself would probably say that a parent's motivations in creating a child, in procreating, are not righteous motivations. They're selfish motivations, right? Like the reason why we have children is because misery loves company, right? It's two things. It's number one, it's simply our genes controlling our thought, and our genes that want to perpetuate themselves are manipulating us into procreating, and we're being used by our biology essentially. And two, it's this idea that misery loves company, that life sucks, we're all unhappy, so we want to bring a child into our lives to make ourselves a little bit happier. But what about the needs of the child? You know, are we just doing it for ourselves? Well, here's the question that I'm asking. What if misery really does just love company? So what? Doesn't an organism that already exists have more rights than an organism that does not exist? How can we speak of the rights of a non-existent entity? A non-existent entity has no rights because it has no existence. Whereas the parents who already do exist, if they have a way to alleviate their suffering, and that method happens to be misery loves company, bring another person into the world, and even if that person has to suffer, therefore I suffer a little bit less, how can you argue against that? I mean, don't the rights of a person who exists trump the rights of a person who does not exist? Because there are no rights to speak of in a non-existent person. It's a non-existent person. So I see a paradox there. And here's the final thought for this video, and I guess it's kind of a mix between an observation and a question. In other words, you can choose to answer it, and I'd love to hear your answer, or you can just consider it an observation. But I find it interesting that you speak of posterity when it comes to your own actions and your own dedication to your belief system. In other words, you've said, you know, and it goes along the same line of you saying, I'm not dedicated enough to my cause, I'm not suffering enough for my cause, and really the only thing I deserve is, if I'm lucky, to not have my grave pissed on. Well, if you got your way, Gary, there would be no more human species on planet Earth. So who is there going to be to either condemn or praise you? You know, why are you concerned with the opinion of history about you as a person when there will be no one to write history? There will be nobody. And, okay, so that wasn't the final observation. Here's the real final observation. It has to do, again, with the idea of life having positive and negative value. Let us assume that life has more negative value than it has positive value. Let us assume that if you were to weigh somehow, and again, I say there is no method of objectively measuring or weighing pleasure and pain. But if you were to somehow weigh the amount of pleasure and pain in life, and you were to conclude objectively somehow that there is more suffering than there is pleasure in life, that life is more bad than it is good, even if that were true, isn't a negative value worth more than nothing at all? Here's, like, let's put this in terms of math. Okay, -2 is a number. -5 is a number. 0 is not a number. 0 is nothing. So, like, even if we are in the red and not in the black, when it comes to pleasure and pain, you know, isn't it still better to exist than not to exist? Isn't it better to suffer than not to exist at all? So, these are my questions for you, Gary, and like I said, I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not trying to convert you to Christianity or even just get you to leave your house. I've given up on that. I just want to understand. And for what it's worth, if you're interested to know, I was really eager to get you to admit that you don't actually love Ocean, so that I would have an excuse not to like you anymore. And essentially you have done that. Essentially you've admitted that there's no real deep feeling here. It really is just your genes manipulating your brain and giving you the instinct to procreate, and she happens to be the one that tickles your fancy, I guess. And yet, to my surprise, I've found that I still like you. And I guess I just think you're an all right guy. And part of me really wishes that I could go back to the days when I thought you were a bad person. I used to just think of you as a cruel and evil person. I used to think of you as this death cult leader that just wants human life to end because he himself is so miserable. Essentially, I thought of you the same way that Brett Keane did before he changed his mind. And now that I realize that you do actually care about people, that you are a good person at your core, and in fact, a very noble and selfless person in your way, it's so much harder for me to accept that truth. It's really a painful truth to accept, honestly, but it would be so much easier for me to just rationalize that Gary is an evil person, and yet I can't. I know it would be dishonest to do so. I'm forced to admit that you are a good person, Gary, that you do care about others, and you've just found a very, very misguided way of expressing it. And here again, it's just a very bitter pill to swallow. So yeah. So bottom line, I guess you and I are still friends, to the extent to which we ever were. At least I hope we are. I think you're a good person, Gary. I just can't understand how you can see the world the way you do. It's so counterintuitive to everything that I believe and to my own frame of referential experience. I can't wrap my mind around it, and I don't think I ever will. And I guess if you want me to give you something that you might be able to derive a little bit of satisfaction from, like I guess it would be good for me to give you a win to take out of all of this. So I'm going to give you that win by telling you that you will always be a cause of doubt for me. Not that I'm going to abandon Christianity and become an anti-natalist. That's certainly never going to happen, but there always will be this nagging doubt in the back of my head, like, what if Gary is right? What if his way of looking at things is the correct one? And I find that it's been observed by many people how many times I've changed my mind about everything under the sun, whether it comes to politics, philosophy. I've been a left-wing guy, I've been a right-wing guy, I've been a Christian, I've been an atheist, I've been everything under the sun. And I found that at no point in time was I ever able to feel this satisfaction like, oh, I know I've got it right. I know that there's absolutely no chance whatsoever that I could be wrong. Because no matter what belief system I hold, there's always going to be this other group of people on the other side of the fence saying the exact opposite. And I don't think that detracts from my experience as a Christian at all to have doubt. Every Christian has doubt. Just as I think every atheist has doubt, whether they'll admit it or not. And of course, most of them never will. But they do. And I know that because I was one. So I see through the BS. If an atheist wants to tell you, oh, there's never a moment of doubt when I ask myself, I wonder if maybe the Christians are right. They do. They'll never admit it, but they definitely do. And I guess maybe we're all questing after this mythical certainty in our own view of the world, our own belief systems. That's always going to be elusive. None of us are ever going to be able to find that level of certainty. So the best that any of us can do, I guess, is find the philosophy that works for us, and just try to take that as far as it'll carry us in life. But yeah, I mean, Gary, the bottom line is, I don't have a problem with you. I like you, actually. Honestly, I still consider you a person who, to be honest, I love. And it's just really hard for me to admit that you and I are never going to see eye to eye, and there's just some things we can't change.